Rain fell in thin, relentless sheets, tapping against the iron bars of the gate like impatient fingers. The streetlight across the road flickered, casting uneven shadows on the wet pavement. In front of the gated apartment stood a woman, 9 months pregnant, her body heavy with exhaustion and life at the same time. One hand rested on her swollen belly, steadying her breath. The other gripped a small suitcase, the kind people carry when they believe they'll well be gone for a night, not forever. Behind the gate, the apartment lights were still on, warm, bright, alive. She could hear the faint hum of the television through the walls, the muffled sound of a life continuing without her. Just minutes earlier, she had stood inside that same living room, barefoot on polished tiles, listening as the man she had built her life around spoke words that felt rehearsed, almost careless. "I can't do this anymore," he had said, not raising his voice. No anger, no hesitation, just finality. "You're always tired, always sick, always something." Then the words that still rang in her ears as the gate clicked shut behind her. "You're pregnant, not broken. Figure it out." The lock turned. Once, twice, loud in the silence. She didn't scream. She didn't bang on the gate. She didn't beg. Her lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. The rain filled the space where her voice should have been. For a moment, she simply stood there, shoulders slightly slumped, eyes fixed on the gate, as though it might open again if she waited long enough. But it didn't. A car passed, tires hissing through water. Another followed. Headlights briefly illuminated her face, pale, calm, unreadable, before disappearing down the road. A man walking under an umbrella slowed when he noticed her condition. His eyes flicked from her belly to the suitcase, then to the locked gate. He hesitated, just for a second. Then he adjusted his grip on the umbrella and kept walking, shoes splashing softly as he disappeared into the night. The silence returned. No dramatic music, no shouting neighbors, no rescuing stranger. Just rain breath and the quiet weight of betrayal settling into her bones. Inside her, the baby shifted gently, unaware of the cold, unaware of the world waiting on the other side of that gate. She whispered nothing, promised nothing. She simply closed her eyes and inhaled, as if memorizing this moment. Tonight she was discarded like an inconvenience. What her husband didn't see, as he poured himself a drink and congratulated himself on choosing freedom, was the way she straightened her back. The way her hand tightened, not in panic, but in resolve. He didn't know what the silence meant. He thought silence was defeat. He was wrong. Because while he believed he had thrown out a powerless woman, soaked and abandoned in the rain, he had no idea what papers bore her name. No idea whose signature truly mattered. No idea who had been quietly holding the foundation beneath his success all along. And as the rain washed over the empty street, one truth stood unspoken, waiting for its moment to rise. What he didn't know was that this company was never really his. Before that night in the rain, before the locked gate and the silence that followed, she had been someone very easy to overlook. She was calm by nature, educated, but never loud about it. The kind of woman who listened more than she spoke, who chose her words carefully and never used them to dominate a room. When people described her, they often said things like kind, reserved, soft-spoken. No one ever said powerful. She never gave them a reason to. She had been married for years long enough for routines to replace romance and for comfort to settle in quietly. Throughout those years, she had been steady, supportive in ways that didn't demand applause. She believed in her husband when his ideas were still just sketches on scrap paper and late-night conversations whispered over cheap meals. She never pressured him for luxury, never complained when sacrifices were required. When things were tight, she adjusted. When things improved, she stayed the same. She didn't push. She didn't compete. She didn't ask for credit. Her husband, on the other hand, was changing. Once thoughtful and driven, he was now a rising corporate executive, well-dressed, well-connected, and increasingly impressed with himself. A recent promotion had placed him higher than he'd ever been, closer to boardrooms than backrooms, closer to power than struggle. The man who once asked for her opinion now made decisions without mentioning them. The man who once came home early now returned long after midnight, smelling of cologne and confidence. Late nights became normal. Secret meetings became none of your concern. Conversations grew cold to short answers, distracted nods, eyes always on his phone. She noticed everything. She just didn't comment. Her pregnancy arrived during the height of his success. As her body grew heavier, his ego grew louder. As she slowed down, he sped up. He began to see her condition not as a shared journey, but as an inconvenience. Her quiet nature, once comforting, now irritated him. He mistook patience for weakness, silence for ignorance. And yet, beneath all of it, there were details he never questioned. Documents arrived regularly, contracts, agreements, amendments. He skimmed the first page, flipped to the last, and signed where he was told. She sat beside him calmly, reviewing every line before placing her own signature where it was required. Sometimes she signed first, sometimes last, always without comment. He never noticed how carefully she read. At social events, he boasted freely. "I built this company from nothing," he'd say, lifting his glass. "I took all the risks. I carried everyone on my back." She stood beside him, smiling politely, never correcting him, never reminding him who introduced him to his first investor, who sold inherited land quietly, who insisted certain shares be held for stability. When people praised him, she clapped. When they ignored her, she didn't mind. To him, her silence confirmed his story. What he didn't understand, what he never bothered to ask, was why she never needed recognition. Why she never argued about ownership. Why she never panicked, even as the marriage cooled and his confidence hardened into arrogance. He thought he was rising alone. He didn't realize he was standing on ground that wasn't truly his. And as his success peaked and her pregnancy neared its end, the balance between them shifted silently, like a door closing softly before anyone notices the sound. In the beginning, their love was not loud or dramatic. It was practical, patient, and built on belief. They met when ambition was still fragile and failure was a constant shadow. He had ideas, big ones, but little else. No connections, no capital, no safety net. What he did have was conviction, and what she had was something rarer, faith in him when no one else took him seriously. She supported him in ways that never showed up on paper. When his income was uncertain, she covered the gaps without complaint. When plans failed, she steadied him instead of questioning his worth. She listened to his ideas late into the night, asked thoughtful questions, and helped him refine them when others laughed. Friends told her to be careful, warned her about tying her future to a man who dreamed too much. She ignored them. She saw what others didn't, not just the vision, but the discipline underneath it. When opportunities were scarce, she made them, quietly. The land she inherited from her family had always been meant as security, a fallback if life went wrong. She sold it without drama, without announcing it as a sacrifice. The money became seed capital, though she never called it that. When he asked where the funds came from, she simply said, "We'll be fine." She introduced him to people who mattered, former classmates, family associates, professionals who trusted her judgment. She never framed these introductions as favors. She let him believe they were impressed by him alone. And he was good, driven, capable. The company began to grow. With each small success, their life improved. A better apartment, fewer worries about bills, plans that extended beyond survival. Through it all, she remained steady. She didn't rush him, didn't demand timelines, didn't push for luxury. When others praised his hustle, she smiled. When he doubted himself, she reminded him of how far he'd already come. Then she became pregnant. At first, it softened him. He spoke of legacy, of building something that would last. He placed his hand on her belly and promised a future filled with stability and respect. But as months passed and the company expanded faster than expected, something shifted. His success accelerated, and so did his sense of self-importance. Her pregnancy brought vulnerability, physical exhaustion, slower mornings, moments where she needed help instead of giving it. But it also brought clarity. She noticed things she might have once excused. His impatience when she asked simple questions, the way he sighed when she needed to rest, the subtle annoyance in his voice when her body demanded attention. He started coming home later, dressed sharper, speaking differently. Power changed the way he looked at the world and at her. Disrespect crept in quietly, disguised as jokes. Comments about how emotional she was becoming, how she didn't understand business pressure. In public, he corrected her unnecessarily, laughed when she spoke, or talked over her as if she were a junior colleague rather than his wife. At first, she told herself it was stress, growth pains, temporary. Then came the comparisons. He began praising modern women, ambitious, flashy, always put together. Women who didn't slow men down with pregnancy or domestic concerns. He said it casually, over dinner, scrolling through his phone. "These women know how to keep up," he remarked once. She said nothing, though the words landed heavily. She understood the message beneath them. You are becoming an obstacle. Public humiliation followed. At events, he introduced her with less warmth, sometimes not at all. When she spoke, he dismissed her contribution with a smile that felt sharp rather than affectionate. People noticed. Some looked uncomfortable. Others followed his lead. She absorbed it quietly. Inside, something was changing, not into anger, but into awareness. She began to see the pattern clearly. His respect had been conditional. As long as she was giving, sacrificing, smoothing the road ahead, she was valuable. The moment she needed space, care, or acknowledgement, her worth diminished in his eyes. Still, she did not confront him. Not because she was afraid, but because she was learning. She remembered every step of their journey, every document, every conversation, every compromise she had made to protect his pride. She remembered how the foundation of his success had been built, not just with ambition, but with her silence. As her pregnancy advanced, her body slowed, but her mind sharpened. She saw the man he was becoming, and she understood something crucial. The fall would not come from shouting or fighting. It would come from truth meeting arrogance. He believed he had outgrown her. What he didn't realize was that the ground beneath him had always been shaped by her hands. And the moment he mistook her patience for irrelevance, the beginning of the end had already quietly begun. She noticed the other woman long before he ever spoke her name. At first, it was subtle, an unfamiliar perfume clinging to his jacket, sweet and sharp in a way she didn't wear. Then came the constant phone notifications. The screen turned downward whenever she entered the room. He laughed more these days, a lighter, careless laugh she hadn't heard in years. When she asked who he was talking to, he answered too quickly, too smoothly. "Work," he said. "Always work." The other woman was younger. That much was obvious from the way he spoke about her before he even realized he was doing it. He mentioned her energy, her ambition, her drive. She was flashy in a way that drew attention: perfect hair, polished nails, clothes that announced success before she said a word. She admired his position openly, laughed at his stories, praised his decisions without question. Where his wife asked careful questions, this woman offered applause. Money impressed her. Status excited her. And he liked the way she looked at him, as if he were already the man he wanted to be. Slowly, almost unconsciously, he began rewriting the story of his life. What had once been we became, by what had once been shared struggle became his sacrifice. The years his wife had stood beside him quietly were erased and replaced with a narrative where he alone had carried the weight. He told colleagues that marriage had slowed him down. He hinted that responsibility had come too early. When the other woman listened, wide-eyed and sympathetic, he leaned further into the lie. He said his wife didn't understand his ambition anymore, that she was too comfortable, too cautious, that she was holding him back. At home, the tension thickened. The argument that broke everything began over something small, a business decision he announced casually, as though it didn't affect their future at all. She asked one question. Just one. Calmly, thoughtfully. She asked if he'd reviewed the long-term risk. He snapped. The explosion shocked even her. His voice rose, sharp and unfamiliar. He accused her of doubting him, of always questioning his authority, of acting like she knew better when she had never built anything herself. The words spilled out fast, unfiltered, as though they'd been waiting for the right moment to escape. She tried to steady the conversation, reminding him she was only asking out of concern, that they were partners, that the decision carried consequences. That word, partner, pushed him over the edge. "You're not my partner," he said coldly. "You're just here." The silence that followed was heavy. He went further, too far. He said the pregnancy had turned her into a burden, that her tiredness annoyed him, that her presence felt like pressure instead of support. He said she didn't inspire him anymore, that she had become a reminder of everything he was trying to escape. She stood there, one hand resting instinctively on her belly, the other gripping the back of a chair to steady herself. She didn't cry. Her face remained composed, though something inside her fractured quietly. Then he said the words that could never be taken back. "Maybe you should leave," he muttered. Then louder, crueler, "Actually pack your things. I need space." She looked at him, searching his face for hesitation, for regret, for anything that suggested he didn't mean it. There was nothing. She packed slowly, carefully, a few clothes, documents she always kept close, essentials for the baby. He watched from the doorway, arms crossed, detached. When she asked where she was supposed to go, he shrugged. "You'll figure it out," he said. "You always do." When she stepped outside, the air felt colder than it should have. She heard the door close behind her, followed by the unmistakable sound of locks turning. One by one, final, deliberate. That same night, he changed the locks. Not the next day, not after cooling down, that night. He wanted certainty, control, a clean break. Inside, he poured himself a drink and made a call. The other woman laughed on the other end of the line, congratulating him on choosing himself. He told her it was necessary, that he deserved happiness, that the marriage had been over for a long time. He never once thought about the weight she carried physically or emotionally, never wondered where she would sleep, never questioned whether he'd crossed a line that could not be undone. Outside, standing in the rain with a suitcase and a life growing inside her, she felt the truth settle fully for the first time. This was no longer a misunderstanding, no longer stress, no longer a phase. This was betrayal, clear, deliberate, and complete. And as the gates stood locked behind her, one reality became unmistakable. The man she had built alongside had chosen arrogance over loyalty, illusion over truth. What he couldn't see, what he would soon learn, was that in pushing her out so confidently, he hadn't removed a burden. He had severed the very foundation that made his rise possible. And the fall, though silent for now, had already begun. The night did not end at the gate. By the time she reached the small clinic at the edge of the neighborhood, the rain had soaked through her shoes and the hem of her dress. The building was modest faded paint, dim lights, a quiet hum of activity inside. But the nurse at the front desk took one look at her and stood up immediately. No questions, no judgment. Just a chair, a blanket, and a calm voice telling her to sit and breathe. She spent the night there, on a narrow bed behind a thin curtain. The sounds around her were soft and distant footsteps, murmured voices, The occasional cry of a newborn quickly soothed. Her body ached with exhaustion. Not just physical, but the deep, hollow tiredness that comes when trust collapses all at once. At some point in the night, a sharp tightening made her freeze. It wasn't pain exactly, more a warning. A reminder that stress has consequences, that life inside her responded to the chaos around her. The nurse noticed immediately, checked on her gently, spoke in measured tones. She was told to rest, to breathe slowly, to let her body settle. It was an early labor scare. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming enough to make headlines, but enough to terrify her in a quiet, private way. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, memories surfaced, uninvited, vivid, and relentless. She remembered the beginning of the company, long before titles and offices. The original funding that had come together in pieces, stitched quietly from sources no one ever questioned. She remembered meetings she attended without being introduced, papers she reviewed late at night while her husband slept, exhausted from pitching dreams that were already being secured. She remembered her father, a man of quiet influence, never flashy, never loud. He had believed deeply in building structures that outlived ego. When he passed, he left behind not just assets, but instructions, carefully thought out plans for protection, for stability, for legacy, a family foundation, a trust designed to support long-term ventures without drawing attention to itself. The company had been one of those ventures, not gifted, not handed over, supported, structured, protected. Shares had been registered under the trust for stability, for growth, for tax efficiency reasons that sounded boring to anyone uninterested in details. Her name appeared where it needed to, not as a gesture of control, but as a safeguard, a quiet anchor. Her husband had signed the documents, every one of them. He never read past the first page. She had never corrected him when he spoke about ownership, never interrupted his stories about struggle and success, not because she was hiding something, but because she believed something mattered more. She wanted respect, not fear. She wanted a partner who valued her judgment without knowing her leverage. A man who treated her well because it was right, not because he felt small beside her power. She wanted love that stood on character, not contracts. Lying there in the clinic, hand resting protectively on her belly, she understood the cost of that choice. Her silence had protected his pride, but it had also protected his arrogance. The realization didn't make her bitter. It made her clear. The nurse checked on her again near dawn and smiled softly. "You're stable," she said. "Your baby is fine. Just try to rest." Rest felt impossible, but clarity didn't. As the sky outside began to lighten, she reached for her phone. There was only one call she needed to make, not to confront, not to threaten, not to explain, just to set something in motion. She dialed a number she knew by heart. The line connected after one ring. "It's me," she said quietly. Her voice was steady now. "Yes, I'm safe." A pause. "Yes." "Tonight." Another pause. Longer this time. "I need the trust documents reviewed," she continued, "and the board notified." No urgency in tone, just accuracy. She listened, nodding slightly. "No," she added softly. "I don't want anything dramatic. I just want things to be correct." She ended the call and placed the phone beside her. There was no anger burning in her chest, no hunger for revenge. Just a calm resolve settling into place, heavier and steadier than emotion. Outside, morning arrived like it always did, indifferent, quiet, inevitable. Inside that small clinic, at her lowest point, she finally accepted a truth she could no longer ignore. Power doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It waits. And the man who had thrown her out, believing he had won his freedom, had no idea that the call she just made would quietly begin the unraveling of everything he thought he owned, not out of cruelty, but out of truth finally being allowed to stand. He woke the next morning feeling lighter than he had in months. For the first time in a long while, The apartment felt like it belonged to him alone. No quiet presence moving carefully through rooms. No gentle reminders. No questions he didn't feel like answering. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, admiring the version of himself he believed he had finally become, unrestricted, unburdened, free. He told himself he had done the right thing. That night, he met the other woman for dinner. She arrived dressed impeccably, her smile wide and approving, her eyes bright with excitement. When he told her it was over, that his wife was gone, she didn't ask how or why. She raised her glass and congratulated him. They spoke openly now, making plans without lowering their voices. Trips, properties, a wedding, someday soon. She joked about rings and venues, and he laughed along, imagining the image they would present together. Success, youth, admiration. He liked the way she looked at him, as though he were already a finished product. At work, his confidence followed him into every room. Colleagues noticed the shift in his demeanor. He spoke louder in meetings, interrupted more, made decisions quickly, sometimes recklessly, but always with conviction. When an assistant informed him that a board meeting had been scheduled earlier than expected, he barely looked up. "Routine," he said dismissively. Then came the email about the audit. "A standard review," the message said. "Nothing unusual. Just compliance, due diligence, procedural housekeeping." He laughed it off. Audits happened all the time, especially when companies grew as fast as his had. He forwarded the email to his finance team with a short note. Handle it. He trusted the process, trusted the systems he believed he controlled, trusted that his position made him untouchable. Papers began appearing on his desk again, reports, approvals, authorizations. He flipped through them quickly, scanning headings, skimming summaries. The language was dense, deliberately dry. He signed where tabs were placed, initialed where sticky notes indicated. He was busy, important. People were waiting on him. He never noticed how often his signature was paired with someone else's name. The mistress called him during lunch breaks, talking about apartments closer to the city, about merging their lives seamlessly into something sleek and enviable. She spoke of how proud she was of him, how powerful he seemed. He absorbed the praise easily. It confirmed what he already believed, that he was in control, that everything was finally aligning in his favor. What he didn't see was the subtle change in atmosphere around him. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms. Executives exchanged glances he dismissed as stress. His calendar filled with meetings he didn't remember requesting. Legal representatives began attending discussions that once involved only strategy. When he asked questions, answers came carefully precise, neutral, almost rehearsed. Still, he felt no concern. Power, he believed, was loud, visible, assertive, and he had all of that. He signed another stack of documents late one evening, impatient to leave. He barely noticed the title pages, barely registered the language about restructuring, governance alignment, shareholder clarity. It all sounded administrative, necessary, boring. He poured himself a drink at home that night and called the other woman, telling her how smoothly everything was going. She laughed, already picturing a future secured by his success. He spoke of buying a bigger place, of expanding the company internationally, of finally living without compromise. Outside his apartment, the city moved as it always did, indifferent to confidence, unimpressed by ego. What he didn't realize was that the illusion he lived inside was already cracking. The audit was not routine. The board meeting was not a formality. The documents he signed were not harmless. The foundation beneath him, the quiet structure he had never bothered to understand, was shifting. He had mistaken authority for ownership, visibility for control, noise for power. And as he celebrated his freedom, unaware and unbothered, the truth moved closer, calm, methodical, and inevitable. The ground beneath him was already gone. He just hadn't felt the fall yet. The boardroom felt different that morning. It wasn't louder. It wasn't chaotic. It was quiet in a way that made people sit straighter in their chairs. Executives who usually arrived joking and confident took their seats without speaking. Laptops were opened, then closed again. Folders were stacked carefully in front of each person, as if order itself might offer protection. Two legal representatives stood near the head of the table, their presence unmistakable. Not advisors, not observers, authority. He walked in last. Confident, relaxed, still riding the momentum of recent weeks. He nodded to a few colleagues, unaware of the tension he was stepping into. When he noticed the lawyers, he paused briefly, then dismissed the thought. Audit business, he told himself. Formalities. The meeting began without small talk. The screen at the front of the room lit up, displaying charts and timelines, company growth, valuation, share structure. He leaned back slightly, arms crossed, familiar with most of it. He had seen these numbers before. He had presented them himself. Then the slide changed. A name appeared at the top. Her name, not beside his, not below it, above everything. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Below her name, in precise legal language, were the words that altered everything. Majority shareholder, legal owner through trust authority. His breath caught. For a moment, he thought it was a mistake. A formatting error. Someone else with the same name. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The numbers were unmistakable. The percentages left no room for interpretation. The legal representative began speaking, voice calm and neutral, explaining the structure that had been in place from the beginning. The trust, the foundation, the protections, the signatures, all valid, all enforceable. He barely heard the words. His mind raced backward through years of memories. Documents signed quickly, conversations brushed aside, her quiet presence beside him as he talked about his company. The door opened. She entered without announcement. There was no drama in her arrival, no raised voices, no calculated pause. She walked in slowly, composed, her posture straight despite everything she had endured. There was a softness to her face now, a quiet strength new motherhood written gently into her expression. Not fragile, not bitter, grounded. She took a seat near the head of the table. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. He stared at her, searching her face for some sign of triumph, anger, or accusation. There was none. She didn't look at him the way someone looks at an enemy. She looked at him the way someone looks at a fact that can no longer be changed. The legal representative continued. He was never the owner. His role clearly outlined was executive. Employed. Empowered, yes, but never entitled. Every promotion, every authority he held had flowed through governance structures he had never questioned. Through her authority. The truth settled into the room like weight. This wasn't a takeover. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't sudden. It had always been this way. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words failed him. The confidence he carried in no longer fit the reality he was facing. Around the table, eyes shifted, not mocking, not sympathetic, just aware. Power had changed hands without moving an inch. She finally spoke. Her voice was calm, low, almost gentle. "I never needed you to know," she said, meeting his gaze without hostility. "I needed you to respect me. Nothing else. No explanation. No defense. No accusation." That single sentence landed harder than any confrontation ever could. In that moment, he understood everything he had lost. Not the company, not the title, not the money, but the chance to have treated her with dignity when it mattered. The board meeting continued, procedural and controlled. Decisions were made, roles clarified, the future outlined with precision. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was with clarity, not emotion. He sat there, silent now, the illusion fully shattered. The company hadn't been taken from him. It had simply stopped pretending to belong to him. And in that quiet, irreversible reveal, the room bore witness to a truth he would carry far longer than any success he once claimed as his own. The consequences did not arrive with shouting or public spectacle. They came quietly, the way truth often does when it no longer needs permission. Within weeks, his position was redefined. The title he once wore with pride was reduced, then removed entirely. Official statements used careful language, organizational restructuring, leadership realignment, but everyone understood what had happened. The man who once spoke as though the company were an extension of his identity was now a footnote in its future. Invitations stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. The respect he thought was permanent dissolved faster than he ever imagined. Reputation, he learned too late, is fragile when it is built on arrogance. Those who once laughed at his jokes now avoided eye contact. The same people who praised his confidence began to question his judgment. Stories shifted, whisperous applause. He tried to explain, to justify, to frame himself as a victim of circumstance, but power, once lost, rarely listens to excuses. The other woman disappeared just as quietly. At first, she was supportive, insisting everything would work out. But admiration has limits, and her interest had always been tied to what he represented, not who he was. When the status faded, so did her patience. Calls grew shorter. Meetings were postponed. Eventually, they stopped altogether. She moved on, chasing the next symbol of success, leaving him alone with the wreckage of choices he could no longer undo. There were no dramatic confrontations, no final arguments, just absence. She, meanwhile, rebuilt without noise. Her world became smaller and richer at the same time. She focused on her child, on quiet mornings, on steady routines, on rebuilding a sense of safety that had been shattered. Motherhood grounded her, not as a burden, but as a source of clarity. Every decision now passed through a single question. Does this protect what matters most? At work, she led differently than he ever had. There were no speeches about dominance, no performances of authority. She listened. She asked questions. She paid attention to details others ignored. Decisions were made thoughtfully, with long-term impact in mind. Employees noticed the shift immediately. The environment changed, not softer but steadier. Trust replaced fear. Competence replaced ego. She didn't humiliate him. She didn't erase his contributions. She didn't seek revenge. She simply refused to hide anymore. Integrity became the standard, not because she announced it, but because she lived it. People who had once overlooked her now understood the depth of what she had always carried. Not power that demanded attention, but power that sustained everything quietly. And that was the lesson no one in that story could ignore. Power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always arrive loud, aggressive, or impressive. Sometimes it sits silently in the background, reading documents carefully, making sacrifices without applause, holding structures together while others take credit. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is restraint. Sometimes it is wisdom. Sometimes it is strength waiting for the right moment to stand. And perhaps the hardest truth of all is this: the people we dismiss, the ones we overlook because they don't demand recognition, are often the ones holding everything together. They are the foundation beneath success, the quiet force behind stability, the reason things don't collapse sooner. He learned that lesson too late. She learned it just in time. As her life moved forward, calmer, stronger, rooted in dignity, one question lingered, not just for those who watched her story unfold, but for anyone willing to reflect honestly on their own choices. How many people do we mistreat just because we think they have nothing?